All right, welcome culinary students. In this explainer, we're diving into an absolute masterclass on the historical evolution of one of South India's most famous staples. We're looking at the humble idli. Now, as aspiring chefs and food historians, you know that what ends up on the plate is rarely just a recipe. It's usually the result of centuries of trade, innovation, and cultural collision. And today, we're going to unpack all of that.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for today. We're going to look at the great culinary mystery, maritime trade and the kidli, ancient Indian graham cakes, the fermentation revolution, the evolution of steaming tech, and then we'll wrap it all up with a fun culinary challenge and quiz.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the great culinary mystery, uncovering the debated origins of a classic.
Now, as future chefs, you already know the idli. It's that perfectly soft, fluffy, steamed rice cake, right? It's literally the cornerstone of modern South Indian cuisine. But, and here's the twist, its true origins are actually a fiercely debated mystery among food historians. So, where did the modern idli truly originate? Was it born right there in the early Indian kingdoms? Or did the secret to this beloved breakfast staple actually cross the ocean from ancient Indonesia? Well, the answer is a lot more complex than you might think.
Which brings us to Section 2, Maritime Trade and the Kidli, Cultural Diffusion Across the Seas.
Let's look at our first major theory, which was proposed by the renowned Indian food historian K.T. Acharya. He links this dish directly to ancient Indonesian trade routes. Now, what's super fascinating about this timeline is looking at the 7th through the 12th centuries. The Hindu kings of the Sola and Pallava dynasties established really strong maritime ties with the Sanjaya and Shailendra dynasties over in Indonesia. And you know, when kings trade, they don't just trade goods, right? They trade culture. And most importantly for us, they trade food. So Indonesian royal cooks traveling with their kings to India likely shared their deep-rooted culinary traditions. Because remember, Indonesia already had a long-standing tradition of eating fermented and steamed foods. Think of things like tempeh.
And this is just a brilliant illustration of cultural diffusion in action. Ancient Indonesian literature actually mentions a dish called the kedli, which bears a really striking resemblance to the modern idli. It's highly likely that these traveling Indonesian cooks brought their specific technique of fermenting and steaming rice paste directly into ancient Indian royal kitchens. It's just a perfect example of how maritime trade literally shaped the everyday kitchen techniques we rely on today.
All right, moving on to Section 3, Ancient Indian Graham Cakes, the indigenous texts before fermentation.
So, here's the crucial turning point. While Indonesia had the steaming and fermentation down, indigenous Indian texts actually mention similar dishes centuries earlier but with completely different prep methods. Let's look at the earliest written records. First, we've got the Kannada text Vadaradar Hane by Shivakoti Acharya, dating all the way back to 920 CE. He mentions a dish called idlige, but check out the ingredients. It is strictly made from a black gram, or urad dal batter, no rice at all. And get this, it wasn't steamed, it was actually fried or baked. Then, fast forward a bit to 1130 CE, to the Sanskrit encyclopedia Manasalasa, compiled by King Someshvara III. Here we see iddarika, which takes that black gram flour, adds some spices, and cooks it into small cakes. So we're seeing a clear, documented evolution of these early indigenous recipes, long before any modern techniques took hold.
Let's zoom in on that 1130 CE recipe for iddarika. Honestly, these early cakes were incredibly dense. They strictly used a black gram flour base mixed with a very specific ancient spice blend: pepper, cumin, and asafoetida. Completely zero rice. Imagine the flavor profile here compared to what we're used to today. It was heavy, intensely spiced, and just far removed from that light, airy cake we all associate with South Indian breakfasts.
Now for the real breakthrough in Section 4, the fermentation revolution, the 1620 fusion of ingredients and technique.
It wasn't really until around the 14th or 15th century that the shift from a dense dal-only cake to a fluffy rice-and-dal cake truly started happening. Now, as culinary students, you'll immediately recognize these 3 precise steps. Step 1, mixing a batter of both rice and black gram. Step 2, fermenting that batter overnight. And step 3, steaming the fermented mixture. These are the absolute non-negotiable requirements for creating the idli we eat today. The introduction of rice, combined with that long overnight fermentation process, entirely changed the chemical structure of the batter, creating that beautiful spongy aeration. Let's actually contrast these two eras side by side to see how this built up. On the one hand, you have the early idlij of 920 CE. dense, purely black gram, absolutely zero fermentation, and either fried or baked. On the other hand, the modern idli, light, fluffy, this perfect marriage of fermented rice and black gram cooked gently with steam. The difference is literally night and day. One is a heavy, savory snack, the other is a marvel of culinary engineering that completely revolutionized South Indian cuisine.
And here is where it all finally comes together in the historical record. This quote from the Varanaka Samhita in 1620 CE is basically our culinary climax. This text documents the exact historical moment the modern recipe was fully realized and written down. It is the very first time we see all three elements, the rice gram mix, the fermentation, and the steaming, explicitly laid out together in one place.
Let's look at how the kitchen tools kept up in Section 5. Evolution of steaming technology. From cloth to tiered metal.
Now, obviously, a newly popularized dish is going to require new tools, right? You can't mass-produce a steamed cake without the right equipment, so let's examine this technological leap. Originally, cooks just poured the batter directly onto a simple cloth tied tightly over a pot of boiling water. It got the job done, sure, but it was slow. Over time, as the dish just exploded in popularity, we started seeing the invention of specialized idli vessels. And finally, this whole thing culminated in the commercialization phase, the creation of tiered metal plates. This simple but absolutely brilliant bit of engineering allowed cooks to steam multiple cakes at once, which transformed the idli from a slow, specialized dish into the incredibly fast, commercial breakfast staple it is today.
Let's wrap things up with Section 6, Culinary Challenge and Quiz, testing your historical kitchen knowledge.
To cap off this explainer, I've got a practical application for you, and a quick test of your memory. First, the culinary challenge. I'm challenging you advanced learners to get into the kitchen and execute the precise fusion recipe documented in that 1620 Varanaka Samhita. Pay really close attention to your ratios of rice to black gram and observe how that overnight fermentation fundamentally changes the texture and aroma of your batter before it ever even hits the steamer. This right here is where history meets practical application in the kitchen.
And finally, let's see who was paying close attention to our trade routes earlier. According to K.T. Etchia's theory, the maritime trade between the Indian Chola and Pallava dynasties and which specific Indonesian dynasties facilitated the spread of these fermentation and steaming techniques. Go ahead and drop your answer in your notes as you reflect on how ancient trade routes and cultural diffusion forever changed the culinary world. Food is history, guys, and you are the ones keeping it alive. But it definitely begs the question, with modern cooking tech constantly evolving, what's the idli going to look like 500 years from now? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.